Hello, Uriel from Ninja Bear Studio here. Welcome back. In this video, I want to talk about configuring input handlers, and I want to show you the documentation for that and how that works in the showcase. In the documentation site, you will find a step-by-step guide on how to configure input handlers, that of course using Ninja Input. But I also want to show you how that was done in the showcase project, which contains some interesting examples, and I also want to point out some situations that you should be aware of. The first thing when you start a new project and you want to configure Ninja Input is to make sure that you clear the original inputs. So let's say you start a project using the third-person template. You will probably have some input handling code in your event graph. So we want to get rid of that and also make sure that you don't have any predefined input contexts in your project settings. You can search for contexts and make sure that you don't have any default mapping contexts. If you do, you can go ahead and remove them, because otherwise that could generate a conflict between the ones set here and the ones configured in the Ninja Input Manager. With that out of the way, we're ready to configure the Input Manager. Now, in the documentation, you will see that you can configure your Input Manager either in the player character or in the player controller. If you are working on a single player project and your player can only ever control a specific character, then having the input manager in the character blueprint is totally fine. However, if you're working on a multiplayer game or a game where the player can control different characters like a car, a mount, and the main player character, then the controller is the recommended location. In this project, my input manager is in the player controller. In this case, it was set in the C++ base class, but you can do either there or in the blueprint itself. Okay, let's configure our default input setup. The input setup groups a mapping context and all related input handlers. You can create new assets by right-clicking, selecting Ninja Bear Studio, Ninja Input, and Input Setup. Since I already have one, I'll just open it. Like I said, the purpose here is to map input contexts to input handlers. And Ninja Input has a few handlers that you can use. Some of them are for characters, for the gameplay ability system, heads-up display, and you can obviously create your own. Of course, you can select any of those, they are ready to use, but if you're following the documentation or the guide, you will use move, look, and jump. For me, I replace jump with evade. Another thing worth mentioning is the validation that happens every time you save this asset. Let's delete the list of handlers, and now all the actions here are not matched. If I try to save, I will get a validation error. As you can see, the validation is talking about missing input handlers. This is useful because sometimes you have input actions that are repeated across the project and some of your assets, and they have the same name. This can lead to some errors because you have your context pointing to one input action, but your handlers pointing to another one with the same name. So to help avoiding those conflicts, which will lead to very odd errors, the data asset validation will warn you about missing or mismatched actions. Moving on, let's talk about custom handlers. As you can see, I have evade, target lock, primary action event, and we'll talk more about those events when we talk about the combo system, and same for secondary action. This is a matter of personal preference as well, but I like having those custom handlers because I find it easier to manage them outside of the data asset, especially if you have a lot of handlers. You can create new handlers by right-clicking the content browser, selecting Ninja Bear Studio, Ninja Input, and Input Handler. Using the evade handler as an example, you can see that this is an empty handler. I don't have any logic, I don't have any functions. All that I'm doing is extending a gameplay ability system handler to activate ability by tags. Then I am setting default values for the input action and the gameplay tag that will be used to activate the ability. With this done, I can simply add this fully configured input handler to my setup, and I don't really have to do anything else in here. Again, this is a matter of personal preference, and if you only have a couple of handlers, this might be a lot of unnecessary work, and it might be easier to just configure all your handlers in the setup data asset itself. The setup is done. Don't forget to add this to your input manager if you haven't done so already. Now we can hit play and test our setup. We can move around, look around, perform attacks, the evades. Everything looks good. Great, our input setup is done. In the next video, I will show you how to configure your gameplay ability system using Ninja Gas. I hope you found this useful. Please make sure to check the documentation and guides linked in the description. If you have any questions, please feel free to join the Discord server if you aren't there already. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.